All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Ashley Rumschlag, and I am the CEO and president of Teresa's Fund, the nonprofit that operates domesticshelters.org. I'm joined by Rachel Myers, our digital services specialist, and Hannah Craig, our senior content strategist and creator. And they will both be monitoring the chat and the Q&A today throughout the presentation. We are so excited today to be hearing from Dr. CarolAnn Peterson, and she's going to be sharing more about lobbying and how you can influence your government leaders. So just a few housekeeping items before we jump into the presentation. Within 1 week of the presentation, we'll send you a certificate of attendance, again, the transcript, the webinar playback recording, additional resources, and Dr. Peterson has offered to share the slides as well. So those will be in the shared resources folder. We hope that you use domesticshelters.org as a resource to help you throughout your profession. But if you aren't aware of us, we just want to remind you about a few things that we offer, maybe some things that you weren't aware of. So we do have the free online domestic violence resource available to you. We have the searchable database, a library of shareable content. So we have, I think we're closing in on 1,000 articles on the website that answer topics, any question that you could think of. We're always coming up with more as well. And then we also offer custom data reports. So you can kind of get a sense of where you stand within your state, within the country, as far as, pet programs or different service offerings. We also offer in the US a free wish list program. So if you're not signed up for that, it takes 5 minutes to turn it on and add a few items to it. Basically what that does is allow anyone in the world to ship you items that you need to run your program online. So they can go on and send you diapers, they can send you laundry detergent, bed sheets, everything that you need. By setting up that wish list, you allow people to do that. We saw a large increase, or we've seen a continued increase in purchases made on that in the last 3 months of 2021. We saw, I think it was roughly $70,000 in donations made. So it's really a growing program. People are finding it just by searching for, I want to donate to my nearest women's shelter or domestic violence shelter, and they are making donations. So we encourage you to set that up. We'll put some information about that in the chat box. And Rachel, if you'll stick maybe your email address in the chat, that would be great, so people can reach out to you if they want to get that set up. Last thing on this list is our Facebook group. So we have one for victims and survivors, and then we have one for advocates as well. And I know Rachel's busy putting things in the chat, and that will be in there as well. And just a reminder, if you enjoy our webinars, they're all available for free on our website. And you can request a certificate of attendance. We'll share that email address again at the end of the introduction, but it's info@domesticshelters.org. Go ahead and watch it, and then just let us know, and we'll send you the certificate of attendance. And a reminder about the Purple Ribbon Awards. This was really a great year last year to kind of kick off the program, but of course we are doing it again. So nominations are open now until the end of March. And we will be giving away $30,000 again in September to our top winners. So please take a moment to nominate people at your organization, maybe a program that your organization is taking part in, people in your community. There's 30 different categories to choose from. So please, we encourage you to head over to purpleribbon.awards.org to learn more about the program. It's just a fantastic way to recognize, recognize the really hard work that's being done within the domestic violence movement. And it's just a really cool way to celebrate all the amazing things that we're accomplishing and the people that we're helping. And got to kind of slide this one in here. We are so excited about this, the Last I'm Sorry campaign. Many of our domesticshelters.org team and Teresa's Fund team traveled to New York last week to launch this in Times Square. So this is a campaign. We have 2 billboards running in Times Square right now, and that's the one on the left. The one on the right is the billboard that you'll see it on digital billboards all across the United States. So if you happen to see this, if it's safe to do so, snap a picture, email it to us at info@domesticshelters.org, or tag us on social media media. We are just so excited to get this message out because it's a really important way to connect people who maybe don't recognize that they're being abused through kind of the subtle imagery of the empty promises and the gifts that really don't mean anything. So we're really excited about that campaign, and we hope you'll check it out. Okay, again, there's our contact information, info@domesticshelters.org. And I'm so excited now we can introduce CarolAnn Peterson. So I'm delighted to welcome her back. Many of you may remember her from her popular webinar last year about leadership. So I'm going to share a little bit about her. She has such an impressive resume, but she was a former full-time lecturer at USC. She taught courses on topics like domestic violence, policy, and advocacy, and global violence against women. She's a published author. Her book is titled Interpersonal Aggression, Complexities of Domestic and Intimate Partner Abuse. She spent 10 years as a registered lobbyist in California for the California Federation of Business and Professional Women, which included an unofficial advisory role for the original drafting of the Violence Against Women Act. She also has an impressive list of clients as she's hosted trainings for. Again, I could go on and on about CarolAnn and her accomplishments, but we're just so thankful that she offered to join us today. Welcome, CarolAnn. We're so glad to have you.
Good morning and good afternoon, wherever any of you might be. And thank you again for having me.
We had a conversation about, what could you present about next? And I was like, well, lobbying, I don't really know. I mean, lobbyists are bad, right? Like that's a negative term in everyone's mind. So we got to talking and you just said, no, it's about influencing those in power. And you play a really vital role in that. And that once you kind of started to open that up, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else you have to say about it, but that really opened my eyes. So hopefully it will open others people's minds and eyes to how they can make a difference. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll turn off my camera and mute myself, but we'll come back at the end for some Q&A as well. But thank you, CarolAnn.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about some issues, not only about, being an advocate, lobbying, but also even briefly about, voting. And so Ashley, I'll let you advance to the next slide. People think that basically their vote doesn't matter, but it does. And the reason I say that is even if you don't want to vote for a candidate, vote on the propositions, vote on ballot initiatives. One of the best speeches I ever heard came from California Senator Diane Watson one time. And she said, when I don't hear from my constituents, it really means I have to figure out what is going to be best for my district and vote as I see fit. But this is where you as the individual get to tell them what you think about particular pieces of legislation. So one of the things I encourage, sign up with your elected official, local, state, and federal. Even if you don't like them, even if they're not part of your party, follow what they're doing so you can keep them on track. And what Senator Watson actually had to say was that every piece of legislation she votes on influences our lives. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the car we drive, the road we drive it on, our schools, for our children. Every piece of legislation affects us in some way. So it really is important for us to make sure that we're letting them know. I have up here the issues on 2 elections, John Kennedy, which I see there's a typo. When John Kennedy was elected, everybody thought it was a landslide. And those of us who are political junkies kind of wait for the aftermath. And what was discovered was that if one person in every precinct in the country changed their vote, Richard Nixon would have been in office a lot earlier, which I'm sure all of us are kind of going, dodged a bullet briefly, but it really is important to know that. The other was Mondale Ferraro. When Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro ran for office, and after the election, another one where we thought that there was a landslide, what we discovered was 2 people in every precinct had changed their vote. Geraldine Ferraro would have been the first vice president in the White House. So it really is important to keep that in mind. One of the questions that always comes up is who can write legislation? And it's always the concept of legislators, elected officials, lobbyists, anything of that nature. But it actually is a trick question. Anyone can write legislation, including you. So a great example to give you is that in your town or your neighborhood, at a particular intersection, you think that there needs to be a stop sign. You contact your elected official and they think, wow, what a great idea. They'll do some research and then come back and figure out, does there need to be a city ordinance, a state or a federal law that really puts that stop sign in place? And as you, the proposer, they'll keep you informed. They'll check with you. And so this is where it then becomes, how does this process work? We have for you the link in the chat box, I believe, on Schoolhouse Rock. We were testing it out this morning and it doesn't quite pop up with all the sound. And I'm going to spare you all my singing of it. Ashley thought I should perform it, but I turned that down. But it is a quick 3-minute fun piece to know how the process works. But to do that, one of the things I wanted to briefly touch upon is Maria in the chat box says she loves that video. I do too. How did the term lobbyist come about? How was that created? When our country was first formed, Congress didn't have offices. They didn't spend full time in Washington, D.C. They traveled down to D.C. for a couple of months out of the year, did the country's business, and then went home to other jobs. And what would happen is those constituents who happened to be in DC in particular would be in the lobby of the Capitol waiting to talk to their elected official. And that's how the term was created. So a little bit of history that, you know, the term just didn't evolve out of nowhere. It really had some sort of basis in fact. Next slide. So important to know how the process really does work. When a bill is introduced, it will get assigned to a minimum of 2 committees. Now, it can be assigned to multiple committees if there's multiple issues involved, but usually it's at least a minimum of 2. A policy committee, they're going to look at what does this policy mean, what does it look like, and a fiscal committee. And before it gets to those committees, the staff of a legislator is going to make sure it's gone over with legislative counsel. Legislative counsel's whole process is to make sure all the code sections are correct, that everything is constitutionally okay, you're not violating somebody's rights by this piece of legislation, and then it's going to go to the committees for its dissemination. Policy committees are straightforward. It really is, how does this benefit your constituents? Does it benefit the whole state? If it's coming from Congress, does it benefit more than one state? So you're really going to kind of look at that. The fiscal committee is the toughest one. Excuse me. In most states and even in Congress, there's a cap. So California, one of our caps is usually $250,000. Anything below that, we'll go ahead and vote on it, see if it gets passed and what we can do. If it's above $250,000, it goes on what they call suspense. It's going to sit over here and wait till there's a budget. And until there's a budget, that bill is waiting. But it's also a great way for some elected officials, if they don't like you, if they don't like the bill, to actually kill it. Because when the budget comes out, they may look at it and say, we really don't like this bill. And therefore, we're just going to, you know, totally not vote on it ever and bring it out of committee. Everywhere along the way, your bill can be amended. I had one particular piece of legislation in California for putting domestic violence education in the schools. We outlined the entire curriculum. We actually looked at it from all the avenues possible and what classes could teach this. Teachers didn't have to do the training. We were asking domestic shelter staff to assist and do the training. And one of the things that we discovered was that the Department of Education did not want to spend $5 to offset a $50,000 trial somewhere down the way for domestic violence felonies. And we found that very disheartening. And after literally about almost 7 years, the bill came down to, we think schools should have a curriculum. That was it. That was the whole bill. after all that we had done. That was the time I walked away. I said, I can't encourage the passage of a piece of legislation that did nothing. So know what it is that you're willing to not do in terms of the legislation. Where is your bottom line? Where do you stop? One of the things too that you want to look at, who are going to be your yes and no votes? Becomes really important to know members of a committee. One of the things about being a lobbyist is that you trade information with other lobbyists. Longtime colleague of mine, she worked totally different areas, and legislators change committees very frequently. They'll go from one committee to another and somebody replaces them on your committee. We exchange information about who's a good vote, who's not a good vote. What do you know about who they are, how they operate? Becomes valuable information when you're a lobbyist and an advocate, knowing that and knowing where your votes are, because then you can spend your time lobbying those who are swing votes. Those are the legislators who have not made up their mind of how they're voting on your legislation. One of the tidbits I will give you that I did particularly as a lobbyist, but I always encourage constituents to do, when you've contacted a legislator, you're talking about legislation, if they vote the way you want them to vote, send them a handwritten note. It is amazing how far that little touch will go. If they don't vote the way you want, send them an email or a typed letter. Staff in Sacramento knew when I walked in, if they got a 10 number 10 envelope, it was a typed letter basically saying, I didn't like how you voted on our legislation. But if I walked in with a little note card, they knew it was handwritten. And also, remember the staff. That staff goes a long way of getting you in to talk to an elected official or not getting you in. Legislators who had a tendency of voting no, their staff were very familiar with the fact that I was comfortable just talking to them. That if I didn't talk to the elected official, I was okay, but I really wanted to convey to them why it was important for them to understand why I wasn't happy that they voted no, or why I was ecstatic that they voted yes. Also, if you meet with elected officials, understand you probably won't meet with them directly with staff. I consider that a plus. No offense to our elected officials, but they can't read all 4,000 pieces of legislation that we have in California, or the thousands of pieces that they get in DC. Staff know more about this than the elected officials. So talk to the staff, and usually you'll get more time with staff than you do with the elected official because they're running between committee hearings. One of the things too, if you notice when you're watching either C-SPAN or if you watch it, any sort of committee hearings from state or federal level, is they have a notebook in front of them. That is their agenda for the day of what they're voting on in a committee. And when they open their book, left side has information about constituents who have contacted, about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party's line about that piece of legislation, and staff analysis of how it affects the district. One of the quick things I will tell you is that if you make a phone call to an elected official about a piece of legislation, you represent 100 people within a district. That's a lot. Elected officials don't tell you these numbers. If you send a form letter or a form postcard, you represent about 200. It gets a little more play because you took the time to actually mail this as opposed to making a phone call. The biggest, if you send a personal letter, and especially if you put in a personal story, you represent 350 people in a district. Legislators and staff are going to look at how many letters did we get? How many phone calls did we get? And that goes a long way in influencing them about how they are going to vote. And sometimes they're going to vote against party line because they know it's really best for their district. So next slide, please. So one of the things, there are some sort of unwritten rules for nonprofits. Technically, you are not allowed to lobby. If you do any action, it's an unofficial IRS rule. And I say unofficial because the IRS has never put in print what they think should be the percentage of your staff time and money going towards influencing legislators. I use a more conservative rule. I say 10%. So the easier way is get your clients, if they're willing to send a letter, and you can give them a briefing paper. You can give them, even a form letter, hitting the salient points. But then what can happen is they can write their own personal letter. So keep it down at a low end. But as individuals, you can write as many letters as you want. You can even tell legislators how you want them to vote. For nonprofit, you cannot tell them how to vote. You cannot say at the bottom of a briefing paper or letter, we want you to vote yes. But what you can do is say, we believe this legislation is to the benefit of victims because of, or a disadvantage for victims because of. So that's considered education, not lobbying. Fine line there. But literally, as individuals, you can anything at all that you want, as often as you want. The role of lobbyist is actually my job when I was a lobbyist to represent the California Federation of Business and Professional Women. Some lobbying firms represent only Republican clients, some represent only Democratic clients, some represent particular interests, such as some lobbying firms only work on oil and gas information, some work on child welfare, some may work on domestic violence. So it really depends, what that looks like as lobbyist. Now, one of the things I'm going to tell you is that it's going to be very much of a shock. Lobbyists are probably the most ethical in the process. And the reason I can tell you that is we have to make a quarterly report to the Fair Political Practices Commission. And you get a report from your client. There's a report sent from you as the lobbyist and a report sent from the organization that you represent. And if those reports don't match, you can be fined. And the fines are not cheap. Minimum fine is usually $1,000 if something's amiss. You have to report everything. I had to report the legislators I talked to, the legislation I worked on, and if I went to lunch with even a staff member from an elected official's office. So there's really strict standards of what we can do. Now, that doesn't mean you don't get the lobbyist who screws it up for all of us. One in particular who big scandal about the fact that he was representing Native Americans for gambling, but he was also representing the casino owners, and there's really kind of conflict of interest. You usually don't represent both sides, and he was charging each $1 million a month. And when it was found that you had this conflict of interest in the amount that he was charging and the money he was spending buying private yachts and jets, it came to light, and he was prosecuted for that. He's the one who gives the rest of us a bad name, who are out there really pressing very hard for our clients and making sure that things operate the way they should. The other is, I'm going to touch briefly to let you know that term limits doesn't always play a good role. One of the things in California is that we actually did term limits. And the first number of years, the problem is that it left somebody like me in charge. I had legislators calling saying, I want to work on domestic violence legislation. Since staff was cut in term limits, can you help me? And so I was spending a lot of time working with legislators on not just drafting legislation, I was operating with committees. Never do you want your lobbyist to be the representative for an elected official with the committee. That should be between staff and the elected officials who are sitting on a committee. So really important that if you want to consider term limits, what are some of the ramifications that's going to happen in doing that? But all in all, lobbyists are pretty ethical. I learn very quickly, and all of us as lobbyists know this, never lie to a legislator, because if it is found out, your reputation is gone in a heartbeat. You are not going to be working tomorrow. The other is when I was in committee, if I did not have an answer, I very quickly would say to a legislator, I don't know, I will find you an answer. One, because you're willing to cooperate, you're willing to work with them, they find that really great. And you also have to be able to cross party lines. We had a very conservative, ultra Republican in the legislature who very seldom worked on women's issues. And when he wanted to work on domestic violence, he put out a call to all the women's organizations, and I was the only one who showed up. He and I worked together on domestic violence for almost 8 years. And one of the pieces that he did, he made a concession. He was very much anti-choice, but when it came to committee hearings, he would walk out and not vote in committee as a favor to me for having worked with him. Now, he did vote on the floor. So when things got to the floor of the assembly, he needed to represent his constituents and would vote as he felt necessary. But women's organizations said, how did you get him to do that? And I said, it was real easy. I showed up. So be willing to work with somebody from across the aisle. You might not like their politics for a lot of reasons, but if they're willing to work on domestic violence, if they're willing to work on child abuse, take them at their word, because they will become an ally. Next slide. So how do you find out who is your elected officials? The easier is type in literally how to find your elected official. Most states contact your voter registration. They'll on their website, you usually put in your zip code, and it's going to show you who is in Congress, who's in the state. It may or may not show you your elected officials locally. I'm fortunate that the whole entire county I live in is fairly rural. So if I type in Kern County, even my city council members show up and how I can contact them. It really is truly that simple. And as I said, sign up for their newsletters, sign up to know what is it that they're doing. Because what gets lost in the discussion these days, in particular the last probably 10 to 15 years, is elected officials work for us. We pay their salary. They sometimes forget that when they're busy arguing in Sacramento or, trying to think, Tallahassee, Florida, or any state capital or in Congress, that they work for us. We are their boss. And so if we're not telling them how we feel about legislation, they're not going to know. So it's really important for us to know who are they and what are they doing. The other reason to sign up on their website, you're going to see what other pieces of legislation that they work on. You'll also know what's important to them. And if there's something on there that isn't necessarily domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, see where you can find common ground. Maybe there's particular issues within your district that they have on their website, because they usually do list what are the views that they're looking at, what are the issues that they care about. So how to contact them. Really important to keep in mind that state elected officials, their state office, those in Congress, their congressional office, those handle legislative issues. If you have a constituent concern in particular, contact the district office that handles all the constituent concern. And one of the things I'll quickly tell you is that I got a letter from my bank about 7 years ago that I was in a flood zone. And I thought, I live in the high desert. We don't have flood zones out here, very rarely. And I thought, what was this about? After I went through FEMA, after I went through my bank, and on and on and on and on, I couldn't get resolution. And I contacted my congressperson. And I will tell you that my congressperson is not the favorite person in the world. He's Congressman Kevin McCarthy. But he does pay attention to his constituents, and his office worked. And within 48 hours, I had a resolution that I did not live in a flood zone. So that is what the district offices do, both at a state and congressional level. but for legislation, contact them at a higher level. I think I saw a question in the chat box, Ashley, and I wasn't sure if I missed it.
Yeah, I've seen a few come through. Do you have anything else you want to go over? Or should we jump into Q&A?
Let's do some Q&A, and we
Okay.
can kind of wrap up towards the end of some of
Okay.
the additional ways of contacting your elected officials.
All right, perfect. Okay, so I actually had one that I wanted to lead off with that I jotted down. You'd kind of come at the topic from your perspective as what I would assume to be like a registered lobbyist. Is that,
Yes.
What about a regular person that maybe works for a nonprofit, so they have that association, or they just have a topic that they're interested in pushing forward? Is there a difference? Are all of these tactics available to them? Do they need to register as a lobbyist if they're going to start to push for a topic?
You usually don't have to register as a lobbyist unless you're being paid. And so most registered lobbyists are paid by somebody, whether they're part-time or full-time. As an individual, outside of the organizational time, you can write as many letters as you want. You can make as many phone calls as you want, and because they're going to see you as a constituent and an advocate. The nonprofit organization itself, if you're representing the organization, then you have to be careful of how much time and money you're spending on doing that.
That makes sense. And how does that, I think the question that was in the chat was about, what about corporations? Are there restrictions on how they can lobby? Because some organizations on the call today, have a specific social issue or things that they are working towards, but they are in fact, corporations and not nonprofits.
Corporations usually have what they call in-house lobbyists. The person works only for that corporation, such as, IBM or Microsoft. Others, some organizations, a lot of gas and oil don't have in-house lobbyists, and so they hire a lobbying firm. And so lobbying firms have multiple lobbyists. They can have anywhere from 10 to 50, 100 lobbyists that work various issues. But corporations who have only themselves, like Microsoft, would probably, I'm presuming, have an in-house lawyer. That's all they do is represent Microsoft. They represent nobody else. And also, as an offshoot is, kind of political action committees. The reason the California Federation of Business and Professional Women could have a lobbyist is that there's a separate piece from the 501c3 nonprofit, which is a 501c4, which allows you to have a political action committee and a lobbyist without, damaging the nonprofit side of an organization. And so on that basis, that's how the Federation could have me as a lobbyist and a political action committee. And political action committees are what fund a lot of elected officials. Keep in mind, as an individual, if you want to kind of fly under the radar is a polite term, but only contribute $99, $100 or more. The organization, the elected official, or a PAC has to report who you are, your address, and any affiliation that you might have. So I always say you can contribute as many $99 checks as you want, but $100, it's going to get reported. So, it's one of the things that we're accused as women as not supporting our candidates. It may be the fact that we're contributing a lot of $99 checks.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I'm going to jump over to the question sheet here. So, is there any negative aspect to contacting and requesting meetings directly with staff versus trying to, directly contacting elected officials? Are there any pros and cons to that? It sounds like it's easier to meet with a staff member, but does it look differently in the eyes of the elected official if you don't reach out to them?
Actually, elected officials don't mind that you're meeting with staff. They probably won't tell you this, but they're probably more relieved because they go on about doing the business while they're in session and leave it to staff. And staff do brief them. usually about twice a week, every elected official has some sort of briefing with their staff. Any constituents who came in, was there any information that was conveyed? Is there any concerns going on in the district? And so your information is going to get to the elected official. It just may not be the same day you met with staff, but staff also have more time to give you. Elected officials, you'll get maybe 10 minutes, where staff, you could get 20 or more. We have a particular activity for our students when we do the policy for USC School of Social Work, and that is they have to meet with an elected official. They have to take a topic, they have to work in a team, and they have to meet with an elected official. And I had one team a year ago who met with a staff member from the Los Angeles City Mayor's office, and they're figuring 20 minutes, maybe 25. They got an hour and a half with this guy. So you just never know where it's going to go.
That's great. What about if you're writing on behalf of an organization, as opposed to like you're on as a private citizen? Does the number of people that you represent in the eyes of a legislator increase if you were to represent an organization?
Yeah, what I would always tell our constituents to do for business and professional women was put in there that you're from the California Federation of Business and Professional Women, and we represent, at the time I was a lobbyist, 10,000 members. That speaks volumes to staff and elected officials of, oh my gosh, this organization has 10,000 members. That's a lot of influence. So don't hesitate to tell them that. Let them know, because then it puts them on notice that even if all 10,000 are not from their district, it's still a lot of influence.
That's great. Thank you. What about, so the question here is, can you be an immigrant and be a lobbyist? I'm assuming this is maybe is referring to, do you need to be a citizen, a US citizen to be a lobbyist? Are there any restrictions there?
Just make sure that you're documented. And a lot of legal aid might hire somebody who's, an immigrant, because you come with a whole different viewpoint and a lot of different stories that the rest of us wouldn't have. And I've not heard any rule that you cannot be a registered lobbyist if you're an immigrant. Might need to do a little bit of extra research to be sure, but I have not heard that.
Yeah, and I imagine then, if you, as long as you are a constituent, right, someone that can actually vote for a political or a politician, then in a sense that they want to listen to you then, because you are the people that they're serving, right? That is, as long as you can vote, that might be related.
Yeah. Well, you've got two differentiations. If I'm an immigrant, I probably can still be a registered lobbyist, but you're representing a whole organization to multiple legislators, versus if I'm somebody who's an immigrant, it's only my elected official who really is kind of going to listen to me. And we're going to talk a little bit in a moment about kind of how that looks, because you're a face. One of the things that you have to remind elected officials is that there's real people behind these numbers. And so as a person who's an immigrant, what is it you went through to even get here? What did you go through to start to apply for citizenship? That's a real story that elected officials need to hear and should hear. And so as an individual, you can lobby your elected official as much as you want on the issue, but it's really good from the personal perspective because it puts a face.
Yeah, very good. We've got a few more questions left. We got about 20 minutes left. Do you want to dive back into the presentation for just a moment?
Yeah, let's go ahead. And so how do you reach out? How do you contact them? So let's go to the handouts that all of you are going to get at some point in time, so you can have it for your own information. So there are several ways that you can contact a legislator: a form letter, postcard. I have friends who work for volunteer actually for several organizations such as Planned Parenthood, and they're always sending out postcards and form letters, which is fine because it kind of floods the legislative office. The other is a phone call or a personal letter. So if you look down at kind of the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, I have letter or phone call, give the bill number, really important to let them know what are you calling about. If you do a letter, send a briefing paper, and we're going to show you an example of a briefing paper that has kind of bullet points, all the salient points that you need to make. If you make the phone call, I agree, a letter is better. If you make a phone call, ask to speak to the person who's working on, AB 395, or they may say, do you have what that issue is about? If you say domestic violence, they're going to get you to the right staff person, because staff have divisions about who works on what. And so somebody may work on only women's issues. Somebody may work on issues of roads and transportation. So you really want to make sure you get to the right person. Personal letters really do have more of an impact. And if you can tell your personal story, even better. It's why for nonprofits, especially for shelters, if your clients are willing to write a letter and tell their personal story, really makes a huge impact. This is where you can spend a little money without violating any laws. Give them give them an envelope addressed to the elected official with a stamp. Perfect. Then they can write the letter. If you send letters to committees, if your member is not on the committee, then send it only to the chair. So, Chair James Smith, Transportation Committee, whatever, and then CC the other members of the committee. If that is a member, your elected official, address it to Jane Doe, your elected official, and then CC the chair and the other committee members. There's a story I tell on Jess Unruh, who at one time was Speaker of the Assembly in California and just had all kinds of power. He was standing at his desk one day on the floor of the Assembly. He was going through letters and he was throwing some in the trash, never opening them. Somebody came by and said, "Jess, what are you doing?" He said, "Why are you throwing those letters away?" He said, "They're not my constituents." However, if it were addressed to the chair of a committee that he was on, he would open them. So really keep in mind that if you're not a constituent and it's not addressed to them as a member of a committee, they may not read your mail. These days, there's so much mail, most of the time staff will look at it. Staff may or may not open the letter because you are not a constituent, but just kind of keep that in mind. So that gives you an idea of how you contact them and what you should do. Next piece, please. So if you're sending a letter, if you can, include a briefing paper. This is what I would send to all of the members of Business and Professional Women. It would have a bill number, and then, salient points. How many people, if we're writing on homelessness, how many, domestic violence victims might be homeless? Services that are currently provided. Effectiveness of the services that are still needed, what is not being given to them, and a recommended solution that might be in the bill, and then a personal story. Why is this really important to you? Why is it important to your clients? If you're an individual, remember, you can ask them to vote yes or no. If you are a nonprofit organization, you can only tell them the advantages and disadvantages of a bill. You can't ask them to vote yes or no. Put your contact information. How can they reach you? You'd be amazed at really important sometimes how staff will reach out, send you a little note, send you some information, may even contact you. And then just a reminder that if you're meeting with staff, you might get 20 minutes. If you're meeting with an elected official, around 10. Really important. I saw quickly somebody asked about emails. These days, emails kind of count, but staff anymore are so inundated with email that not everybody's office has staff staying on top of them. So believe it or not, sometimes snail mail or the phone call is really better. It's sometimes technology is great and sometimes technology is not in our favor. Other questions? I think I saw somebody ask for a sample letter. I do believe I have a sample letter somewhere. I will get that to Ashley or Rachel, and in time for all of you to sort of have something to go off. Other questions?
You mentioned that nonprofits may not lobby, but then you kind of shared that 20% rule. So it sounds like, kind of a recap, nonprofits can't tell a elected official how to vote. But can you kind of re-examine that? It says, the question says, the IRS says 501c3 organization may engage in some lobbying, but not too much lobbying activity, risk loss of tax exempt status. Can you kind of clarify that?
Yeah, what the lobbying would be is if you decide to, contact congressional people on the Violence Against Women Act. And so you can send out a letter from the organization and have staff spend a little bit of time kind of putting together a briefing paper. But it's, the unofficial rule from IRS is 20% of staff and money combined. I say 10%, just make it always on the safer side. That's why it's easier to hand off to let your clients do the letter writing and do very minimal work and money on that. And also too, the 501c3 status, if you send a letter on behalf of the organization, or you include a briefing paper on behalf of the organization, that's where you cannot ask for a yes or no vote. That's where you put, why is this bill advantageous or not advantageous to victims of domestic violence?
What about if you kind of, another question that came in was, what about on a personal level? So let's say, obviously I work for a nonprofit, Teresa's Fund. If I wanted to, as Ashley Rumschlag, private citizen, send a letter to my representatives, is that a different scenario?
Yes, you're an individual. So if you're writing strictly your name, don't mention the organization whatsoever, you can send as many letters as you want. Okay. It's when you represent the organization. So if you say, Ashley Rumsfeld, I'm CEO, president of Teresa's Fund, and, we really have an interest, you're going to start to muddy the waters and it's going to get really cloudy. And may put yourself and the organization kind of on a narrow little ledge there.
That makes sense. Okay, perfect. So what are some of, you mentioned kind of staffers for elective officials. What are kind of some titles within the staff? Are there some that have more power? Do the titles change, or is it more so, like you said, that they just kind of associate with a specific topic?
Titles change from office to office, and some have more power. Had one staffer that I worked with off and on, and he had been in the Capitol long enough and worked for enough legislators. He made more than the legislators. In California, staff salaries are released once a year, so you know what people make. And he was making well over $200,000, and this was like 25 years ago. So he had been around long enough to, quote unquote, know where the bodies were buried, but he also had a lot of power, a lot of influence, because he had been there for a very long time. Those who haven't been there quite that long don't get the same power, the same influence. Most staffers at a district level come from the district they worked on the campaign. Those in Sacramento come from a long line of staffers who have been in Sacramento a very long time and worked there for a very long time.
So is that, I know you said the titles kind of change from area to area, but I mean, there are specific titles within a staff. So it may be like, is it like senior staffer or junior staffer, that kind of thing, or are there specific
what you may have is senior, you may have senior advisor, you may have senior associate, and it also varies from office to office based on how much power and influence I want to give you as my staffer. And also what I want to pay you. So pay grades are almost like military, depending on your title. There's a range that you'll get paid. And so, but usually I find the easier is just ask who's working on this piece of legislation and don't worry about the titles.
Okay, got it. And kind of a follow-up. So if you want to reach out, and you mentioned that we can actually see how much people are being paid, which would obviously give us some idea of who's in power, who has a little bit more pull
Yes.
in the office. How do you actually get that information?
Usually, well, when I was a registered lobbyist, I got it automatically. But I'm not sure how it works in every state, but in California, if I would typed in California state legislative staff, somewhere there's going to be a report from the Fair Political Practices Commission that would pop up, and I could see the latest report.
Okay, interesting. And just to clarify, kind of on the previous question or 2 questions ago, is a letter from a board member. I assume that because they are stating that they have an affiliation with the organization, that's no different than a staff member or a team
Correct.
member writing a letter. Okay, perfect.
Correct.
Any tips for, obviously with the pandemic and COVID, there's some things that have changed as far as, just any accessibility to people in their normal work life. Any best practices that you can share for when you're just unable to reach someone?
Be patient.
Okay.
It really, I know for my students, it was really difficult. They'd say, it's been 2 months, I've made 6 phone calls, nobody's returning my phone call. At that point, because they were obviously working on a project, I'd say either change the topic or find a different elected official. If it's your elected official, at that point in time, if nobody's answering your phone call, go ahead and send an email, or do both. Make a phone call, send an email, send snail mail, do all of it. One of the things I taught my students was that when I would make complaints, didn't matter airlines or transportation or whoever, I would CC every news station in Los Angeles. It would just put them on notice that I'm willing to kind of put you out there in the public eye. And so sometimes you have to nudge your elected officials and say, I've called, this is my 6th message. Don't mean to be pushy, but I am a constituent. And so kind of remind them, they report to you without being offensive.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to state, is that, go into this knowing that you have a right to be heard, right? Yes. It's not as though you're being overbearing or you're doing something wrong. You have a right, and you have the general expectation to be heard. So that's good to know. So you know when to kind of, ask nicely first, and then gentle reminder, then just kind of, as you need to escalate things and remind them that they do report to you and that you have the right to be heard.
Without saying that.
Yeah. Any other tips for building those relationships? I mean, at any level, from your local county commissioners, city council, things like that, all the way up to your state and state representatives. Are there?
Yeah. What I do, at least at a local level, is I always see the agenda of my city council. What are they talking about? What are they working on? Just so I know. Same thing, even though I'm not overly fond always of Kevin McCarthy, I'm on his email list. I get notifications. I know what he's working on. I know what he's voting on. Try and ignore, this is hard to do, the news media. I mean, the news media does not paint Kevin McCarthy in the best light. And there are some areas where I do shake my head. But there are other areas where he will step up for his constituents. And so I try not to always be negative when I contact the office. I try and put a positive spin when he's done something that is really good for our district. And so don't always think your elected official is a bad person. And also sometimes try and understand, especially at the congressional level, many times there's a piece of really excellent legislation and your elected official may be voting no. This is where it gets complicated at the national level. They're what we call riders. People are tagging on extra pieces of legislation that have nothing to do with the bill that you're interested in. They got tagged on because they could do it. And at the end, your elected official may vote no because all those little riders are not something that they can vote for.
Yeah, right. It gets complex, and hopefully yeah, they can kind of help. Hopefully there's a way to learn about that so you understand why they didn't vote that way.
Right.
We have time for maybe one last question, and I think it's a good one to kind of wrap on. Just, as an individual who maybe is just, passionate about the topic of domestic violence, maybe it's a, personal experience, or someone that they know has experienced domestic violence, but isn't associated with a shelter or program, or, doesn't work for a specific organization. Any parting words for what that person could do, kind of maybe recapping some of what you already said, or anything new that they should be doing?
Be concerned of what your elected officials are doing, because remember, they influence every part of our life. So take an active interest. Without telling them how we feel about how they're voting, they're not going to hear us. So sitting back and being silent is, it's like being silent on domestic violence. If you're not talking about the issue and educating, people don't know. The same goes for your elected officials. Let them know you're out there. Let them know you have an interest. And you may have more than one interest with all my elected officials. I'm looking at their website, because it's not just domestic violence. I'm looking at transportation in a rural community. I'm looking at how we handle issues of gun issues, because a lot of ranchers are in my area, a lot of farmers. And how we even handle pesticides. And also, because I live in a rural area, I'm always looking to see how many pot farms are coming into the area. We in California have legalized marijuana, and there are pot farms popping up all over the place. So look at other issues that you may be concerned about from your elected officials.
Yes, it sounds like stay informed, stay engaged, understand what's going on. Yeah,
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been really informative. I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone else has taken away some pieces of information that will help them to better engage and make a change in their communities. So just a thank you again for being here.
And thank you all for having me again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate you doing so. And just a quick reminder that the webinar recording, slides, transcript, and a certificate of attendance, and all the shared resources we mentioned today will be sent out within a week of today. And if you are a call-in listener, don't forget to send us an email to info@domesticshelters.org so we know where to send those materials. But with that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's presentation. Take care, everyone.